worked the graveyard shift? What if your last customer was something not human? In this chilling tale, Steve discovers that some customers should never be served. Welcome, my friends, to another spine-tingling story. Tonight, we step into the flickering lights of a 7-Eleven, where a young man's quiet shift turns into a nightmare. This is the story of Steve, who thought the store was empty, until the last customer walked in. But beware, this is no ordinary customer. Before we begin, don't forget to put on your headphones for the best experience, because some sounds are meant to be felt as much as they are heard. Steve never thought much about the graveyard shift at 7-Eleven. It was just a job, a temporary gig to keep him afloat while he figured out what he wanted to do with his life. Most nights were uneventful. He'd sit behind the counter, scrolling through his phone, occasionally ringing up a bag of chips or some late-night energy drink for the regulars. But this particular night, something was off. It was almost 11 p.m., and Steve was alone in the store. It wasn't unusual for him to work solo this late. His coworker, Brian, had called in sick earlier, leaving Steve to cover the rest of the shift by himself. The store was quiet, too quiet for his liking. The hum of the refrigerators in the back and the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead were the only sounds that filled the space. Every now and then, Steve would hear a car drive by outside, but no one had come in for nearly an hour. He leaned back in his chair, stifling a yawn. It had been a long day, and he was looking forward to closing up. Just one more hour, he thought, trying to shake off the grogginess that was setting in. The store phone rang, snapping him out of his daze. Steve glanced at the clock, 11:05 p.m. He didn't recognize the number on the caller ID, but he picked up anyway. 7-Eleven. "This is Steve," he said, his voice tired but polite. No response. "Hello?" He tried again. There was nothing on the other end. Just silence. Steve frowned, waiting for a moment before hanging up. Probably a prank call, he thought. It wasn't the first time someone had messed with him late at night. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. The same number. 7-Eleven. "This is Steve," he repeated, already annoyed. Again, silence. He was about to hang up when he thought he heard something, very faint, almost like breathing. "Who is this?" Steve asked, his voice a little sharper now. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." No response. Just the breathing, slow and deliberate. Steve slammed the phone down, his heart pounding a little harder than it should have. He stood up and walked around the counter, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had crept up on him. The store felt different now. The soft buzz of the lights seemed louder, the shadows in the corners a little darker. He walked down the aisles, pretending to straighten up the shelves, but really just trying to calm his nerves. It was probably some bored teenager trying to spook him. No big deal. As Steve rounded the corner of the snack aisle, he heard the bell above the door chime. Finally, a customer. He turned to greet them, but the words caught in his throat. There was no one there. The door had opened, but the store was empty. He stared at the entrance, confused. The automatic doors usually only opened when someone was standing right in front of them, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Steve slowly walked toward the front of the store, glancing outside. The parking lot was empty, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp. He stepped closer to the door, waiting for it to open again. It didn't. He stood there for a few moments, the silence pressing in on him. He was just about to head back behind the counter when the phone rang again. The same number. Steve hesitated before answering. His hand hovered over the receiver, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't want to pick it up. There was something wrong, something he couldn't explain but could feel deep in his gut. The phone rang again, louder this time, like it was demanding his attention. With a deep breath, he answered. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. This time, there was no breathing. Instead, a soft, raspy voice whispered through the line, "I'm coming." Steve's blood ran cold. He slammed the phone down, stumbling back from the counter. His heart was racing now, panic setting in. This wasn't a prank. This was something else. Something worse. He quickly locked the doors, glancing outside to make sure no one was lingering in the parking lot. It was still empty, but the shadows seemed longer, darker than before. Steve hurried back behind the counter, pulling out his phone to call his manager. As he dialed the number, the store lights flickered. He froze, watching as the lights buzzed and dimmed, casting the aisles in a faint, eerie glow. Then the lights went out completely. The store was plunged into darkness. Steve's breath hitched. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight, the small beam cutting through the blackness. His hands were shaking as he tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just a power outage. But deep down, he knew something else was going on. The store was too quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerators had stopped. It was like the entire building had been swallowed by silence. And then, from the back of the store, he heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on the tile floor. Steve's flashlight trembled as he pointed it toward the back of the store, his heart hammering in his chest. The beam of light flickered over the shelves, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But the footsteps continued. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. "Hello?" Steve called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" No response. He backed away from the counter, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The footsteps grew louder, and Steve realized with a jolt of terror that they weren't coming from the back of the store anymore. They were right behind him. He spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the front of the store. Empty. There was no one there. The bell above the door chimed again. Steve whipped around, his flashlight aimed at the entrance. The door was wide open, but still, no one was there. His breathing quickened, panic clawing at his throat. He was alone, wasn't he? He turned to run back to the counter, but stopped in his tracks. There, in the reflection of the store's front windows, was a figure. A man, tall and thin, standing just a few feet behind him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, dark, empty sockets, stared straight at Steve through the glass. The man's mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide for his face, as if it had been stretched by some unseen force. Steve's flashlight flickered, and the figure disappeared from the reflection. He whipped around, but the store was empty. The footsteps started again, louder, faster. They were all around him now, echoing through the aisles. Steve's mind raced. He had to get out, now. He sprinted toward the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But as he reached the entrance, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He yanked at the handles, but they wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Frantic, he pounded on the glass, screaming for help. But the parking lot outside was deserted. No one could hear him. The lights flickered back on, but something was wrong. The store was bathed in a dim, sickly yellow glow, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. The aisles seemed longer now, stretching out into the darkness, like a maze. Steve turned, his back pressed against the door, his flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes darted around the store, searching for the figure, but it was gone. For a moment, everything was still. The footsteps had stopped. The store was silent once again. Steve took a shaky breath, his heart still pounding. Maybe it was over. Maybe... He. The sound was faint, barely a whisper. But Steve heard it clear as day. The soft, mocking giggle echoed through the store, sending a chill down his spine. He turned toward the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. And there, standing at the end of the aisle, was the figure, the man with the twisted smile. His hollow eyes stared straight at Steve, unblinking, unfeeling. Steve backed away, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The man took a step forward, then another, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "Stay away!" Steve shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The man smiled wider, his mouth stretching impossibly far, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. Steve turned and ran, sprinting down the aisles, his flashlight bouncing in his hand. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get away. He rounded the corner, heading for the back exit, but when he got there, the door was gone. The wall stretched on endlessly. No sign of the door he'd used countless times before. His head spun. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. He doubled back, running down another aisle, but the store had changed. The shelves were taller now, the aisles darker, narrower. The store was twisting around him, warping into something unnatural. The man's footsteps echoed behind him, slow and steady. Steve's breath caught in his throat. He was trapped. He darted into the storage room, slamming the door behind him. His flashlight flickered as he pressed his back against the door, trying to catch his breath. The storage room was dark and cramped, filled with boxes of supplies and shelves stacked high with inventory. The faint hum of the old refrigerator unit in the corner was the only sound that broke the eerie silence. Steve's breath was ragged, his chest heaving with every gasp as he strained to listen for the footsteps outside. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own frantic breathing. Maybe, just maybe, he had lost it. He wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't sure what was happening, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary night. As Steve glanced around the room, his flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible changes in the store. Was he hallucinating? Or had the store itself become some kind of nightmare? Then suddenly the lights in the storage room flickered off. Steve's heart jumped into his throat, and the room plunged into darkness. His flashlight, his last remaining light source, began to sputter. The small beam of light flickered wildly, casting fleeting shadows on the walls, and Steve's panic grew. He pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if the store itself had sealed him inside. Just as Steve felt the walls closing in on him, the soft sound of breathing filled the room. It was right behind him. Slowly, trembling, Steve turned around. His flashlight barely held out, but in that brief moment, he saw it, standing just a few feet away, shrouded in the blackness of the storage room. The man. His grotesque, twisted grin gleamed in the faint light, and his hollow, dark eyes seemed to bore into Steve's very soul. He. The sound was soft, almost childlike, but it sent an icy chill through Steve's entire body. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow, deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. Steve stumbled backward, crashing into a shelf. Boxes tumbled to the floor, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on the figure, on the twisted smile that seemed to grow wider with every step it took. "Stay away from me!" Steve shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The figure paused, tilting its head slightly, as though amused by his panic. Then, in an instant, it lunged forward. Steve's flashlight died. The room was plunged into complete darkness. Steve didn't remember how he made it out of the storage room. His mind was a blur of panic and adrenaline. All he knew was that he had run, faster than he'd ever run in his life. The next thing he remembered was bursting through the front door of the 7-Eleven, the cool night air hitting him like a slap to the face. He collapsed onto the sidewalk outside, gasping for breath. The parking lot was empty, the single streetlight still flickering above him. The world outside was normal. No twisted aisles, no vanishing doors, no monstrous figures with hollow eyes. But Steve knew what he had seen. He sat there for what felt like hours, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. What had just happened? Was it real? Was he losing his mind? After what felt like an eternity, Steve pulled himself to his feet. His legs were shaky, and his whole body ached with fear and exhaustion. But he knew he couldn't stay there any longer. He had to get away from the store, away from whatever had just happened. Without looking back, Steve stumbled across the parking lot to his car. He fumbled with his keys, his hands still trembling, before finally managing to unlock the door. He collapsed into the driver's seat, his head spinning. He started the car, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving the 7-Eleven behind him. But as he drove away, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on him from all sides. In the rearview mirror, something moved. He glanced up, his heart stopping cold. There, in the back seat, was the man. The same pale, twisted face, the same wide, grotesque grin, staring at him from the shadows. He. The sound filled the car, echoing in Steve's ears as he slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the empty road. But when he turned around, the back seat was empty. Shaking, Steve looked back at the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. The days that followed were a blur for Steve. He quit his job at the 7-Eleven without explanation, refusing to step foot inside the store again. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the man with the twisted smile. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that grin, heard that awful, mocking sound. He tried to tell himself it wasn't real, that it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But deep down, he knew the truth. It had followed him. It was still out there, waiting for him. And then, one night, it came back. Steve had been sitting in his apartment staring blankly at the TV when he heard it. A soft, faint giggle from somewhere in the shadows. He. His blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes scanning the room. At first, everything seemed normal. The apartment was dark, but there was nothing unusual. But then he saw it. In the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was the man. His wide grin stretched impossibly far, his hollow eyes fixed on Steve. He. The last thing Steve saw was that smile, growing larger and larger as the figure moved closer until the darkness swallowed him whole. Steve was never seen again. His apartment was found empty, his car still parked outside. The police conducted a search but found no trace of him. No signs of foul play, no explanation for his sudden disappearance. The 7-Eleven where Steve had worked remained open, though the store had trouble keeping employees. Some claimed it was haunted, that strange things happened late at night, doors opening on their own, lights flickering, and the faint sound of giggling echoing through the aisles. They say that if you visit the store at 11 p.m., when the night is quiet and the store is empty, you might hear it too. He. And if you do, you'd better leave before the last customer finds you. And so, Steve's fate remains unknown, swallowed by the shadows of a night that never seemed to end. The next time you're working late or stopping by a store in the dead of night, remember his story. Some customers don't leave once they enter. If you hear a giggle in the darkness, you know what to do. Until next time, my dear listeners, stay safe and always keep an eye on the door, for it may not stay shut for long.